Mr. Speaker, I yield 5 minutes to myself.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to also acknowledge Mr. Marshall and the powerful sentiments he just shared with all of us. Mr. Speaker, this debate is long overdue. It's our first extended and substantive debate on the war in Iraq since Congress gave the President the authority to invade more than 4 years ago. But if we do nothing more than debate the President's escalation plan, we will not keep faith with the American people, who rightly expect this new Congress to bring our costly involvement in Iraq to a close. And while the resolution before us is largely symbolic and non-binding, it can be, and I think it should be, the opening part of a longer, thoughtful debate about our long-term national interests, not only in Iraq, but the entire Middle East. So this resolution is a start, and I will vote for it because I agree with the message it sends. The resolution expresses disapproval of the President sending more troops to Iraq, an action that is contrary to the wise advice of the Iraq Study Group, critical members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and experienced military commanders like former Secretary of State Colin Powell. The President's escalation is most likely too small to be effective, and adopting new counterinsurgency tactics comes 2 years too late. The resolution, in my opinion, represents the correct response to these facts. It expresses support for our brave men and women in uniform, but disagreement with a policy of military escalation. Mr. Speaker, as we speak here today, the death toll in Iraq rises, and the war continues to drain our national treasury, stretch our armed forces, and weaken our capacity to effectively counter Islamic terrorism. Congress needs to send the message that things must change. I oppose the Bush administration's decision to go to war in Iraq, and I have never once regretted that vote. But today we must focus on the future. We cannot move the clock back, but we need to avoid making a bad situation worse. We should not be scaling up our military mission in Iraq. We should be scaling back. We need to make the U.S. military footprint lighter, not in order to hasten defeat or failure in Iraq, but to salvage a critical measure of security and stability in a region of the world that we can ill afford to abandon. As a member of the Armed Services Committee, I know about the pressures on our active duty and National Guard and Reserve soldiers. They lack enough equipment and training. They are experiencing multiple or extended deployments and limited time at home between deployments. But to be successful, our men and women must be properly trained, equipped, and ready to deploy worldwide quickly. Shortfalls in personnel, equipment, or training increase the risk to our troops and to their mission. In short, this administration's policies have brought us to the point where we not only cannot sustain an escalation in Iraq, but also we are not fully prepared for other contingencies. But that's not the only reason I oppose the escalation. I don't think the President's rationale for it makes sense, no matter our readiness levels. The just released National Intelligence Estimate on Iraq agrees that the term civil war accurately describes what's happening in Iraq and suggests that the conflict may in fact be worse than a civil war. Putting more Americans at risk is not a recipe for victory. And as a new Foreign Relations Council report notes, we bear responsibility for developments within Iraq, but increasingly without the ability to shape those developments in a positive direction. So what should be the way forward? For one, I believe a reduction of military forces in Iraq and a phased redeployment of our armed forces to border regions like Anbar and the Kurdish areas of Iraq would be effective. That can give us flexibility to act militarily in Iraq if necessary, but will also increase the pressure on the Iraqi government to move toward political reconciliation. I don't think an immediate withdrawal of American forces or setting a date certain for withdrawal makes sense, but neither does an open-ended commitment for American blood and treasure. And as bad as the situation is in Iraq, we must work to avoid a collapse in the region, not only because we have a moral obligation to the people of Iraq, but also because our national security has been badly compromised by the Bush administration's failures. We should adopt the main policy recommendations of the Iraq Study Group, including stronger efforts at diplomacy in the region. It is not in the interests of any nation to have Iraq descend into further civil war and chaos. As challenging as diplomacy is in the Middle East, I believe the sacrifice of our soldiers demands that we engage in serious regional talks, including those with our adversaries, Syria and Iran. And finally, Mr. Speaker, I'm convinced, I yield myself an additional minute.
Gentleman is recognized 1 minute.
Finally, I'm convinced we must reach for bipartisanship in crafting our policy in Iraq. Mr. Speaker, the stakes in Iraq are very high. The outcome in this region will have consequences for future generations that will long outlive those of us who are in Congress today. Great leaders acknowledge mistakes, learn, and chart a new course. For the sake of future generations and to keep faith with the generations that built America, let us be a nation of great leaders. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.